Welcome, everyone. So we'll just get right started. Thank you so much for joining us this Thursday. This is our second week of seminars on Afro-Brazil. Last week we had a wonderful session in person, and this week we're virtual. I really want to extend my gratitude to our seminar participants and our seminar leaders for creating generative conversations. Please also be on the lookout for our summer sessions, which will go live in July and will be in person at the museum this August. So you'll see an announcement for that shortly. I'm very delighted to introduce our speaker today, Luis Nicolau Parés, who led a really great set of seminars and discussions this week. He is professor of anthropology at the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil and a leading scholar on Afro-Brazilian religions and the African diaspora. His research covers the history and anthropology of West African and Afro-Brazilian religions and their cultural transformations in the Atlantic world. He has published extensively on these topics and is the author of The Formation of Candomblé, Voodoo History and Ritual in Brazil in 2007, Ore Opai a Morte, published in 2016, and the co-editor of Sorcery in the Black Atlantic, the University of Chicago Press, published in 2011. His latest book is Joaquim de Almeida, published in 2023. So we're very excited and grateful to have you here with us to give your talk tonight, and we will leave time for questions at the end. So please hold on to those. I will pass the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Donna. I would like also to thank the organizers of these lectures and also the people that have joined to attend the talk. And with further ado, I will initiate my talk, which will deal with Afro-Atlantic biographies and geographies, the movement of return to Africa by former enslaved people from Brazil in the 19th century. This relates somehow to my latest research, which is framed within the Atlantic world, and it has to do with these movements of return to Africa that happened in the 19th century from the Americas back to Africa. And there were different movements at different periods of time in this Atlantic history. And there was one region in West Africa that is Sierra Leone, which received like returnees or some people that didn't in fact return, but that came for the first time from the North America since the late 18th century. And those were people loyalists to the English, to the British, that were in refugees somehow in Canada, and then were sent to London, and then some of them went to Sierra Leone. So there was all this movement of Afro-Americans that were settled and reestablished in late 18th century and early 19th century. In Sierra Leone, sometime later in the 1820s, there was another wave of Afro-Americans from the United States that came to Liberia on the organization of the American Colonization Society, which sent these free people of color of America to the West African territory. But these were mostly, as I already suggested, people, black people from the United States or North America that were on the Anglo-Saxon, let's say, cultural language and so on. And what I would like to focus today is on this other movement of return, which happened a bit later, particularly since the 1830s, and that moved from Brazil and in some smaller scale from Cuba to this region of West Africa that corresponds to today's Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, that the Portuguese knew as Costa da Mina, the Mina Coast. And it is this Lusophone, let's say, migration or diaspora that I would like to concentrate and focus today. These individuals that came back to the Mina Coast were known by different names once they returned. Sometimes Brazilians, or even Portuguese, or Agudás. That's the term that nowadays it's more likely to be heard, referring to this group of returnees, the Agudás. And they somehow became, with time, a sort of elite that was distinguished from autochthonous people, and somehow established a kind of embryon or emerging bourgeoisie or middle class that operated, let's say, in the margins of the imperial powers. And this movement, in the case of Brazil, became prominent and very clear since 1835, after a revolt, a slave revolt in the city of Salvador de Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil, in January of 1835. It's known as the Malay Revolt, and that generated in the fear among the white elites and authorities, and so there was a strong repression against the black population that targeted particularly those freed Africans, some of which could be linked to or had some sort of affiliation with the Muslim religion, and others that were just targeted because they were like prosperous Africans that, once freed, had managed to accumulate some wealth and were perceived as somehow a menace to the established order of Brazil. And there were different waves of these returnees until the late 19th century. From 35 to the last decade of the 19th century, there was a continuous flow of this return to West Africa. The numbers, the estimates are variable. Some authors calculate between 4,000, others go up to 8,000. It's not clear because the records are very fragmented and sparse, but it were in the thousands that they returned. Now, when we think about this group of the Agudás or the returnees, one has to understand that that was a very heterogeneous group, both socially and let's say racially, in the sense that the group included the descendants of the white Portuguese merchants or Brazilian merchants that were operating in that region during the period of the slave trade, that they were established there, had the descendants with native women, and had this continuity through generations. These descendants of white or mixed race Portuguese and Brazilians, and to those there were the returnees that came from Brazil that were Africans and sometimes Creole, that is born in black borns in Brazil, and those joined the pre-existing white mixed race merchants and configured this kind of community, which was distinguished in particular by the language, by the speaking the Portuguese, then also by forming part of this merchant community that was involved in the Atlantic trade, initially with the slave trade, and then also with the palm oil trade and other commodities in the Atlantic. So there were these people that, or these agudas that could claim some link to these Portuguese and Brazilian merchants who never experienced the slavery, while there was this other side of the agudas who were descendants of Africans that have endured this violent and oppressive experience of slavery. And that made that the group of the agudas was heterogeneous and had its own inner tensions. When they returned, these agudas, they settled in different parts of the Mina coast, which included both the slave coast and the Gold Coast. The first wave, which is the one that I will be focusing today, in the aftermath of the Malay Revolt in 1835, mostly settled in, see if I can use this, yeah, okay, in this region of Ouida and Ague, which is between the Grand Popo and Anejo, so this region of what's today the Republic of Benin. And a second wave that came in the second half of the 19th century, when the Atlantic slave trade had already been interrupted, went rather to this eastern port of Lagos in present-day Nigeria. So, but there were some of these returnees that went to Lomé, they went to Accra in Ghana, and nowadays they are spread throughout Western Africa in different cities, particularly normally in the littoral, in the coast. And as I mentioned before, these agudas were able through trade to accumulate wealth, which provided the possibility of, for instance, developing this architecture that in a way is a reminiscence or an influence of colonial Brazilian architecture, the sobrados, these two-story buildings. That was a characteristic that was brought to West Africa by these former slaves from Brazil, and it's still today a characteristic of this group, this social group in all the West African region. Some of them are still preserved. Many of these buildings are nowadays in ruins, and it's it's a heritage that I think it's worth taking care. Anyway, what I would like today is to focus on the reasons or the motivations that led these former slaves in Brazil to go back to West Africa, and to understand the logic of this return, which were the reasons and the kind of forces and decisions that took them to take this let's say, in many cases, it was a second diaspora. People that had already experienced the forceful experience of the Middle Passage, this traumatic experience, now they had to go the way back to West Africa in a second diaspora, because in many cases, it was not a return to their homelands, but it was a return to these cities in the coast that were not necessarily the places where they came from. This research, it's the result of a project that was developed in the 2012 to 2014-15, and that was called the Atlantic Families Project, so networks of sociability between Bahia and Benin, that I developed with a historian, Élisée Soumoni, who's already dead, and another North American historian, Lisa Castillo, who lives in Bahia, in Salvador, and we coordinated together this project that had a particular methodology which consisted in exchanging information between Benin and Bahia, taking the documents from the archives in Bahia regarding these former slaves, and taking this documentation to the descendants of these families that are today in Benin. And on the hand, they would return with oral memories and sometimes written documents from what they knew about their Brazilian ancestors. And with this information, we would go back to the archives and then try to find information about these new characters and new names. And so we were able to reconstruct, in some cases, lineages that were kind of broken in the past, and the memory was scarce. But with this research, we tried to establish these connection points, and that was very fruitful, and was and the result of it was also like playing with the contemporary memory of this past for these communities in West Africa. So it was not just a kind of historical archival research, but it had this also ethnographic, if you want, complement to it that made it more challenging, and also like with this, I would say, political dimension of contemporary dynamics of the agudas today in the region. And one of the axis that kind of oriented our research was this interest in reconstructing biographies or biographical profiles. Sometimes probably it's not right to talk about biographies, but somehow of life trajectories of some of these individuals. And this fits somehow or establishes some convergence and synergy with what some scholars have called the biographical turn in Black Atlantic studies that has been going on since the 1990s at least. And one of the characteristics being this focus on subaltern Black agents or actors, historical subjects. And while the biography is always a tricky kind of approach, because somehow it limits the time scope in which you analyze a particular social reality, and kind of could be, criticized in the sense that doesn't give an understanding of the structural, let's say, history around these individuals' lives. On the other hand, it has the advantage of providing some sort of human scale understanding of these motivations and these behaviors and these sort of collective dynamics that could operate on the ground, that are the kind of basis for the history and the memory that we are interested in historical studies. So, well, just for the record, I wanted to mention that this is the result of a collaborative project involving many different actors. Also local actors like Farouk Santana here in the image, who's a teacher and a local historian, and that also had their own memories and documentation, and that this sort of exchange was made possible. Okay, in order to give this context to these biographies, I would like to mention three elements. And one is the pre-existence of what could be called an Afro-Bahian elite, that is a minority of freed Africans that were able to escape slavery, to buy their freedom, and to gain some sort of autonomy and to accumulate certain kind of wealth. Sometimes it was in the form of slaves, sometimes it was in the form of land, sometimes it was in the form of real estate, but they were able in a slave society to kind of emerge as leading figures for the Black African community in Salvador, at least. And it must be emphasized that this was a minority within a minority. So there were a few, perhaps in the hundreds of these Africans among a population of 4,000 or 5,000 freed Africans. So it means that it was like 5% of those freed Africans, which were already a minority within the African population, that were able to accumulate some wealth and also leave wills and that sort of documents that permits nowadays to trace a bit of their paths. But it was precisely from these wealthy freed Africans that can identify those who return to Africa. So in order to return to Africa, you had to have some wealth, some possibilities to buy the passage and the ticket to go to West Africa, and that was an investment, and was not everybody that could afford to do this trip. But the presence of this Afro-Bahian elite is also a problematic term, but I won't. For the time being, I'm using it for the sake of clarity and efficiency. Another contextual element, I think it's relevant to mention that this was the period, like the 30s and 40s, the period of the illegal slave trade, which had generated a lot of uncertainty in these sort of relationships between Africa, but that engage people from all the social scale in Brazil, from the top merchants and to the officials in middle kind of stages to the more popular segments. Everybody somehow participated from this trade, this Atlantic trade, which was the most lucrative at the period, and even also some of these wealthy Africans, not all of them, but some of them participated in small scale, trying to do some business. So what I'm saying this because it was precisely because of this Atlantic trade that those who return already had some context and knowledge of what was going on in the West African territories. And in some cases, they had context that could help them once they took this decision to return to Africa. And this was the result, I insist, of this weaving of an Atlantic community that had been going on since the early 19th century, in the 20s and so on, that had possibilitated this sort of communication. And the third element that needs to be emphasized to understand this movement of return was, of course, the Malay Revolt, which was this insurgency of both slaves and freed Africans, mostly of the Nago, or as they were called, the Yoruba people from West Africa, that took the city or wanted to take the city by surprise and to kind of make a revolution and taking the power, but they were denounced, and then the revolt was suffocated before it started, though there was a lot of violence and 70 people died, and subsequently there was a very strong persecution and repression of those suspicious of having participated in this Malay revolt. Malay is the name, the Yoruba name of the Muslims. So behind the fact that there was this ethnic kind of centrality of the Nago, and together with the Hausa and other Muslim Africans in the city, there was this religious kind of drive that organized this movement of insurgency. But after the revolt, which is considered the most important revolt, slave revolt in Brazil, and one of the most important in the Americas in 1835, the elites, the authorities were very scared about this danger of the revolts, and then began to launch a systematic repression and to pass legislation so to control and to provoke the expulsion of this undesired presence of Africans in the city. So there were different laws that made the life of freed Africans very complicated. They could not buy land, they could not buy real estate, they had to pay taxes each annually. And also there was this other law that permitted the authorities to expel, to deportation. It's a very actual subject, that with this deport of anybody, any freed man suspected of threatening, as they said, our security. So deportation was a possibility for any African at that point. So there was a persecution of those who were involved in the revolt, but this persecution kind of expanded to freed Africans in general. The freed Africans, and particularly those that were more prestigious or that had managed to accumulate some wealth, were perceived as a danger, and they were always on the eye of the police and so on. So after the Malay revolt, it's when many of those freed Africans, before being deported by force, decided somehow to save their belongings as quick as possible, and they decided for a voluntary kind of return. And it is in this return that we have some indications of some of the reasons that could lead some of these Africans back to their homeland. And here you can see a graph of the percentage of the different African nations, as they were named, this ethnic diversity of Africans, of those who returned immediately after the Malay revolt. And you can see the majority of them were Nago, which is the Yoruba speaking, as I mentioned before, who were the main actors in the Malay revolt, but also the Hausa and the Borno and the Tapa, which were populations, African populations, which characterized by the affiliation to Islam. And what's interesting is if you compare the proportion of these, for instance, the Hausa, that there were 23% of those who returned. In fact, there were only 8% among the freed African population. That means that those that were affiliated to Islam felt the danger of the repression more heavily than other groups. And those were the ones that rapidly tried to escape from Salvador de Bahia. While there are other groups like the Jeje, that those are the ones who spoke the Fon language, the neighbors of the Yoruba in West Africa. They were known as Jeje in Bahia. They constituted the 17% of those who asked for passports to go back to Africa. But in fact, they didn't participate at all in the Malay revolt. So these people may have other reasons to return. That was not because of and they were not affiliated to Islam. So the logic of return may have been another one that I will try to explain later on. But one of the things that the literature on the agudas of this return movement emphasizes is that most of these Africans were escaping from religious persecution against Islam. And these, I think, the passports or these registrations of passports suggest that that was the case, that these groups that were associated with Islam were the most prominent in asking for passports. But it doesn't explain or it doesn't give the whole picture. And there were many other people that decided to return for other reasons. And this is what I will try to show in the next minutes. As I also mentioned, there were different waves of these returnees. Here I only will show very briefly this period of 35 to 37. It's when the majority of Africans decide or constitute the majority of the migrants, of those that left Bahia. But for instance, in the 40s to the 50s, what we see is a very important increase of Brazilian travelers and even Portuguese travelers. And this is again the period, as I mentioned before, of the illegal slave trade. Those were mostly men traveling on their own or with their partners for business reasons. And the business reasons basically was the illegal slave trade. When the slave trade ended up in 1850, again, we see an emergence of those Africans traveling back to West Africa. And when they were Africans, they only normally traveled in groups. There were families. There were families with their aggregates, with their dependents, associates, etc. So this is a striking difference in how these different periods generated different kind of demography and sociology of the groups that were traveling. And but what I will be focusing in the rest of my talk is on this initial moment post revolt of the Malays, when you have this peak of the migration of Africans and their families. This is a summary of some of the things I have already mentioned, that this repression of the Malay revolt targeted Islam practitioners, but also prosperous freed Africans perceived as a menace to the authorities. And here there are different individuals that you can identify in the records, in the documents. and so it was very clear that they had nothing to do with the revolt, but they were just deported or expelled or decided to return because of this pressure of a society that did perhaps allow to a certain kind of economic growth of these freed Africans, but would not allow any space for political organization or political aspirations. It must be remembered, for instance, that after Brazilian independence in 1823, in 1824, next year, there was a new constitution that did not recognize the citizenship of freed Africans. So they recognized the citizenship of the Creole, the Brazilian-born blacks, but did not recognize the citizenship of the freed Africans. So they became stateless individuals that could not have any sort of recognition or rights in the new empire of Brazil. That is, I think, a strong reason also to think when we think about reasons for this will to return, this political asphyxiation. And then there were the ones that were also persecuted because they were perceived as being involved in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, that after the Malay Revolt, there were some of the authorities that thought that the slave trade should stop in order to kind of decrease the presence of Africans in Brazil. So the ones that were perceived as being involved in the slave trade, the illegal slave trade, were also persecuted. Okay, from now to the end of my talk, I would like to focus on three cases. I don't know how much time I will have to go in detail for each one of them, but at least to show as an example, as an illustration of this diversity of motivations that led these Africans and their descendants to return to the Mina coast. One is the case of Antonio Pereira dos Santos and Maria da Gloria de São José, two prosperous freedmen and freedwomen, Africans of the Nago nation, that is the Yoruba nation, that in 1836, they traveled together. And what's interesting about this group is that they had at least 50 people. When you look at the records, these passport books, it's just a list of names who say where they go and what's their name and the nation, the ethnic identification, but little less. It's like there's no connection between the names. But looking at other records, you begin to see that they have all these relationships of they are either children, or they are married together, or they are former slaves, and so on. So you are able to reconstruct groups that were traveling together in particular moments. And in this case, these two Africans organize a group of some 50 individuals, and that traveled in May of 1836. And what, as I mentioned, or as I was going to say, the characteristic is that they had a very prominent presence of Muslim affiliation. And some of the former slaves, for instance, of Maria da Gloria de São José, became the imams or the leadership of the mosque of Agüe once they return. And this, for instance, Daniel Mamadou Belo da Gloria, who was a former slave of Maria da Gloria, was the first imam of this mosque that you can see in the image in the neighborhood of Diata in Ague. And his son, who also traveled with him in this return trip, was Adriano, who also became the successor of his father, leading the mosque in Ague. And also the Antonio Pereira dos Santos was also known as Yacuba, who is also an Arab name for Jacob. And that suggests that this group was affiliated to Islam, and that the reason they decided to return may have to do with this religious persecution I have mentioned before. Here we can see in a picture, a rare picture in the late 19th century. This figure in the center is Adriano da Gloria, who is praying, leading the prayers for the New Year's Eve. And behind you can see all these figures which are related to the Egungun, ancestral spirits of the Yoruba. So you can also sense the kind of Islam that returned from Brazil to West Africa was rather open, flexible, and accepting the presence of elements of other religious traditions. So it was not a fundamentalist Orthodox Islam, but it was a kind of ecumenic, kind of tolerant Islam that was brought back from Brazil with these returnees. Okay, a second case would be the case of a couple of Africans, again, Nagos, that is Yoruba speaking, which were called José Pedro Autran and Francisca da Silva. Those again were two freedmen, prosperous, with slave property, with a lot of prestige, and with real estate. For instance, they had a house probably in this area here, if not this one, the one behind, where was a three-story house, and they participated in the Catholic brotherhoods of the city, like here the Black Catholic Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary, and so there were these Afro-Bahian elite, or members of this Afro-Bahian elite I was mentioning before. And Francisca da Silva, the woman, the leading woman of this couple, was also known as Iyana So, which is the title of the priestess of Shango, this Yoruba Orisha, in the Yoruba kingdom of Oyo. So in order to receive this title, she must have been a very senior and prestigious priestess that had a candomblé, or one of these religious temples of the African deities, in this particular building in Ladeira do Carmo. And so this couple also, Francisca da Silva had two sons that were, after the Malay Revolt, they were denounced by the neighbors for participating in these religious meetings and for having some of these Islamic charms, the bolsas de Mandinga. So they were denounced and they were condemned to workforce and to prison. And the mother, Francisca da Silva, pleaded with the emperor to commute the sentence for deportation. And she kind of said that she would pay for all the costs of this repatriation, of this deportation of her sons. And she said that she would never come back to Brazil. And finally, the emperor considered this commutation, and so they returned in another group that was composed by the couple, Francisco and José Pedro and Francisca da Silva, together with the former slaves that they had freed some weeks before the travel in order to accompany them in this return trip. But in this case, when she writes to the emperor, she states very clearly that she would leave the Brazilian territory not because she, and I'm quoting here, not because she is forced to do so by some higher order, that is by law, but because she does not want to be subject to being compromised at any time by people who are hostile to her. So that suggests that the Francisca da Silva and her husband had some sort of enemies, probably powerful enemies that were pressing her to get out of the country. And this is what I'm calling the micropolitics of the local dynamics that generated this climate after the revolt of denouncing your neighbor and trying to take advantage of this moment of insecurity and instability. And it is in this context, and this, so that the reason here would not be particularly because of the participation in the Malay revolt, but because these other political or micro-political dynamics that were operating at the same time. So they return with this group, as I said, of different clients and people, aggregated individuals to this leading couple, and they establish in the city of Ouida. And also from this group, another of the former slaves of Francisca da Silva, Marcelina da Silva, returned 2 years later to Salvador, where she continued to or resumed the activities of the religious community of the Orishas under the mentorship of Shango. And this temple that was initiated by Francisca da Silva and then continued by Marcelina da Silva, who was her former slave, became one of the most prominent references of candomblé, or these Afro-Brazilian religions in Bahia and in Brazil, generally speaking, to the point that this temple was recognized in 1982 as part of Brazilian national heritage. So at the source of this movement of return, there was also the formation of this religious community in Brazil, but also in Ouida, where this group settled. There we trace the kind of family that were descendants from this couple, which are known as Vilaça Quilofé, and still today they keep a shrine with some of the elements for the worship of Shango and other deities, so that this tradition of the Orisha Shango was somehow preserved and continued through time, even though only in the late 20th century and early 21st century, the family was led by a Catholic priest. And so there's this tension within the family between these traditions of the Orisha worship and together this centrality of Catholic colonial presence in the house of this family. So this was the second case, and then we go to the third case. I'm unfortunately have to run a little bit, and I cannot be too precise with the details. But this third case will help us to understand or to illustrate another potential dynamic of return, which has to do with an economic logic of return, some sort of material calculations that were involved in this decision-taking to return. And to do this, I will mention the case of Joaquim de Almeida, who was also an African, a freed African. In this case of the Jeje nation, that is of the Fon-speaking people neighboring the Yoruba. He was from the Mahir region in the north of Abomey, the Dahomean kingdom. And he was enslaved and for many years served as a slave of Manuel Joaquim de Almeida, who was a sea captain, a Pernambucan sea captain involved in the slave trade and residing in Bahia. And Manuel Joaquim de Almeida took his slave in his trips to Africa, so that Joaquim, as a slave, participated in this commerce during a few years. Once he was freed, he also continued to engage in this commerce, in this trade, Atlantic trade. And before the revolt, he was engaged in a case, a judicial process, in which he was accused of having bought a slave after 1831, which established that any African that was introduced in Brazil after that date would be considered a free slave, because it was illegal to introduce Africans at that point. But he claimed that he had bought this slave previous to 1831, so that it was the legitimate owner of this slave. And so there was this dispute about the ownership of this particular slave, was named Cipriano. And that took 2 years, 1834 and 1835. After the Malay revolt, he was still being judged about this particular case. So he was under the radar of the police, the local police, and under the pressure of this wave of persecution of those that were involved in the legal slave trade. And in 1835, when he finally is acquainted from this judicial process, he tries to go with some of his partners in the business to Angola in a very quick move, trying to escape somehow. But apparently this trip doesn't happen. The boat was not available or whatever reason. But in 1836, he decides to organize this return trip, not with just his partners, but with all his social entourage, with his women and friends and the children. So another large group of these Africans, in this case of a Jeje nation, that take this decision to dislocate the center of operations from Bahia to the West African coast. In that particular case, I think that there are, of course, several reasons why these people decided to go back. But one of my hypotheses is that Joaquim de Almeida and his partners also calculated that at this point, it was very interesting for them to be in the African coast, because the illegal slave trade had changed the structure of the trade, and in the sense that, for instance, it had made the factor working on shore the key figure to organize the slave trade. Previously, it was the sea captain that did the trade and spent many weeks and months trying to negotiate the different captives and so on. With illegality, it was not possible for the captain to spend so much time. So it was the factor on shore that was responsible for recruiting all the captives, and when they were ready in one night or in few hours, they will embark all these captives into the vessel, and it will speed up off to Bahia or the Americas. So the illegality made the need of these factors on shore much more acute and important. And it is this calculation, Joaquim de Almeida, being an African, knowledgeable of the languages and of the trade, that he decided, I think, to make this move and to change his operative center from Bahia to West Africa. So that would involve another logic in the thinking and the induction of this return to Africa. But I'm just closing my talk. There was not only or we cannot think in terms of reductionist terms of either an economic logic or religious logic or a political logic. I think most of the times you had different levels interacting the ones with the others. And in this case, for instance, in the case of Joaquim de Almeida, he is also well known for being the introducer of Catholicism in the region. And he built a chapel, a Catholic chapel, when he decided to return with all this group. And this involved this collective initiative with also his female partners that also contributed to the reproduction of what was a kind of a brotherhood in Brazil, in Salvador. He somehow reorganized this around this chapel and used the baptism as an institution that helped him to create this big family, to use the African chief model, where you, in order to acquire power, you need to accumulate wealth of people. So the baptism, the Catholic baptism, of which Joaquim de Almeida organized 3 big baptisms, collective baptisms throughout a decade before he died. He used this Catholic knowledge and tradition and institutions to secure this group of followers and to articulate this merchant kind of community. And it is the conjunction of these elements of Catholicism, of this religious affiliation that was very kind of pragmatic and let's say flexible also, together with the Lusophony, the language, the Portuguese language, and the merchant activity, the trade that define the boundaries of this group of the Agudas. But of course, there were also the Muslim, there were also the Orisha worshippers that were interacting with this group. This should not be thought as a kind of closed kind of group, but a kind of very dynamic in their borders and in this processes of inclusion and exclusion within the Agudas. But it is this different levels of religious affiliation together with this merchant economic activity that in the beginning, in the first decades, was closely attached to the slave trade, but then changed as the region changed to the more illicit trade of palm oil and other commodities, established this sort of merchant community, our Atlantic community, because it was connected still to Bahia and other places in the Atlantic. So, I mean, I could extend myself, maybe the dialogue or the questions, I could expand on some of the issues, but I think I've already talked for an hour and more than I was asked to. So I'll stop here, and thanking you for your attention, and I'm willing to answer any question or comments, or to hear any comments if there are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it's time to close, but thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for your questions and your participation. So
Yeah. Thank you very much also to you and to all the people that joined us. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
thank you and good night, everyone.